Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. 3 months ago, my girlfriend Mia and I were desperately in need of an escape from our cramped city apartment and the suffocating routine of our daily lives. We'd been dating for 2 years, and both of us shared a love for the outdoors that our urban lifestyle rarely allowed us to indulge. Mia worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, spending her days hunched over a computer screen, while I pushed papers around as an insurance adjuster. The fluorescent lights and recycled air were slowly draining the life from both of us. "We need to get out of here," Mia had said one particularly gray Tuesday evening, her hazel eyes reflecting the exhaustion we both felt. Somewhere with real air, real trees, real silence. I couldn't have agreed more. We spent hours that night researching camping destinations within driving distance, finally settling on Mount Shasta in Northern California. The mountain had always held a mystique for both of us, its imposing 14,179-foot peak visible from hundreds of miles away, surrounded by dense forests and crystal-clear streams. The online reviews painted it as a paradise for hikers and stargazers, exactly what we were looking for. We planned the trip meticulously. I purchased a new 2-person tent, one of those expensive models with reinforced fabric and multiple ventilation panels. Mia gathered our camping supplies, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, a portable camp stove, enough food for 3 days, and her prized possession, a high-powered telescope she'd saved months to buy. We even bought a detailed topographical map of the area, marking potential campsites with red circles. The drive up to Mount Shasta took us through winding mountain roads lined with towering pine trees that seemed to close in around our small Honda Civic as we climbed higher. The air grew thinner and cleaner with each mile, and I rolled down the windows to breathe in the crisp mountain air. Mia had her feet up on the dashboard, her dark hair whipping in the breeze as she navigated with the paper map spread across her lap. "Turn left here," she called out, pointing to a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main highway. According to this, there should be a clearing about 2 miles up this trail. The dirt road was barely wide enough for our car, branches scraping against the windows as we navigated the winding path. After what felt like an eternity of careful driving, we emerged into a beautiful circular clearing surrounded by massive Douglas fir trees. A small stream bubbled nearby, and the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. "This is perfect," Mia breathed, already unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out of the car. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, carpeted with soft pine needles and dotted with smooth granite boulders. The stream was close enough that we could hear its gentle murmur, but far enough away that we wouldn't be bothered by moisture or insects. Most importantly, we seemed to be completely alone. No other cars, no signs of recent camping, just pristine wilderness. Setting up camp took us the better part of 2 hours, partly because we kept stopping to admire our surroundings, and partly because the new tent proved more complicated than expected. The instruction manual might as well have been written in hieroglyphics, and we spent a frustrating 30 minutes trying to figure out which poles went where before finally getting the structure stable. "I think we're supposed to be engineers to set this thing up," I muttered, wiping sweat from my forehead as Mia hammered in the final stake. "At least it's up," she laughed, crawling inside to arrange our sleeping bags. "And look at this space, we could host a dinner party in here." She was right. The tent was surprisingly spacious, with enough room for both of us to sit up comfortably and store our gear along the sides. We set up her telescope on a flat boulder outside, positioned to give us the best view of the night sky once darkness fell. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we started a fire in a ring of stones we'd gathered from the stream bed. The wood caught easily, dry pine and fir branches we'd collected from the forest floor, and soon we had a cheerful blaze crackling in the growing dusk. "This is exactly what we needed," Mia said, settling beside me on a fallen log we'd dragged over to serve as a bench. She leaned against my shoulder, her hair smelling like pine smoke and the vanilla shampoo she always used. Dinner was simple but satisfying. Hot dogs roasted over the open flames, followed by s'mores that left our fingers sticky with marshmallow and melted chocolate. We talked about everything and nothing, our voices the only human sounds in the vast wilderness around us. As full darkness settled over the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably, and we moved closer to the fire. The stars, when they finally appeared, were absolutely breathtaking. Away from the light pollution of the city, the sky exploded into a tapestry of silver points against the velvet black. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a gossamer bridge, and Mia spent over an hour with her telescope, excitedly calling me over to look at Saturn's rings, Jupiter's moons, and nebulae whose names I couldn't pronounce. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she adjusted the telescope's focus. "Look at this cluster. You can see individual stars that must be millions of miles apart." By the time we finally retreated to our tent, it was well past midnight. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows on the tent walls as we settled into our sleeping bags. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I was grateful for the tent's insulation and the warmth of Mia's body pressed against mine. The sounds of the forest at night were soothing. The whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of an owl, the gentle burble of the stream. Occasionally we heard the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, but nothing that seemed threatening or out of place. Within minutes, both of us had drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the fresh air and physical activity. I jerked awake with the suddenness of someone who'd been startled by a loud noise, though I couldn't immediately identify what had woken me. My digital watch showed 2:47 a.m., and the tent was pitch black around us. Beside me, Mia was still sleeping, her breathing deep and regular, one arm thrown across my chest. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the forest floor outside our tent. Not the light patter of small animals, but the deliberate heavy tread of human feet moving slowly through the pine needles and twigs. My heart immediately began racing, pumping adrenaline through my system as I strained to listen. The footsteps were methodical, circling our campsite at a distance of maybe 20 feet from our tent. I could hear branches snapping underfoot and the rustle of disturbed vegetation as whoever it was moved through the undergrowth. Most disturbing of all were the voices, hushed whispers that I couldn't quite make out, like people having a conversation in another room. I gently shook Mia awake, pressing my finger to her lips when she started to speak. Her eyes widened when she saw my expression, and she immediately went still, listening. The footsteps continued their circuit around our camp, and now we could both hear at least 3 different voices whispering urgently to each other. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of the night? We were miles from the nearest road, in an area that required hiking to reach. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and we'd seen no other vehicles or signs of human presence when we'd arrived. Yet here were multiple people moving through the forest at nearly 3 a.m., speaking in hushed tones as they circled our isolated campsite. The whispers grew closer, and I could make out the cadence of conversation even though the words remained indistinct. There seemed to be at least 4 different voices, both male and female, based on the pitch variations. They were speaking in what sounded like English, but the words were too quiet and distorted by the forest acoustics for me to understand their meaning. Mia's fingers dug into my arm, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could feel her whole body trembling against mine. My own heart was hammering so hard I was afraid the sound might carry through the tent walls. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, to call out, to unzip the tent and confront whoever was out there, to grab our car keys and make a run for it. But fear kept me paralyzed. We were trapped in a fabric shell in the middle of nowhere, with unknown people circling us like predators. The smart thing to do was remain hidden and hope they would simply move on. Yet as minutes stretched into what felt like hours, it became clear that these weren't random hikers who had stumbled across our campsite. The footsteps stopped directly beside where Mia was sleeping, near the head of the tent. We could hear someone breathing heavily just inches from her face, separated only by the thin nylon material. The breathing was deep and deliberate, almost like they were trying to catch our scent. Mia's entire body went rigid with terror, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to shout at whoever was out there to leave us alone. Then came the sound that will haunt my dreams forever. Fingers slowly dragging across the tent fabric, making a deliberate squeaking noise as they moved back and forth. The person was drawing something on the outside of our tent, using their fingernails to trace patterns in the nylon. The sound was methodical and purposeful, like someone carefully crafting a design. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, the fingernails dragging across the tent fabric in deliberate patterns. Sometimes the motion would pause as if the person was studying their work, then resume with even more purpose. I could feel each drag of their nails through the tent wall, the vibration traveling through the fabric and into my bones. Mia was no longer just trembling. Her entire body was shaking with barely controlled terror. I wrapped my arms around her, trying to provide some comfort while fighting my own panic. The breathing outside the tent had grown heavier, more labored, as if the effort of drawing whatever symbol they were creating was physically taxing. The whispered conversations continued around our campsite, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I began to make out individual words, phrases like perfect placement and strong connection, and something that sounded like completion of the circle. None of it made sense, but the tone was becoming increasingly excited, almost fevered. After what must have been 20 minutes of continuous scratching, the sound finally stopped. The person outside our tent stepped back, and I heard footsteps moving away toward the center of our campsite. The whispers grew more animated, and I thought I heard someone say, "It is ready." Ready for what? The question echoed in my mind as I strained to understand what was happening. Through the tent material, I could see the faint glow of what looked like flashlights or lanterns moving around our campsite. The beams of light danced across the walls, creating shifting patterns of illumination that only added to the surreal horror of our situation. Then came new sounds. The scraping of metal against wood, rhythmic and purposeful. Someone was carving into the trees around our campsite, the blade of a knife or some other tool biting deep into the bark. The carving went on for nearly an hour, moving from tree to tree in a systematic pattern that seemed to encompass our entire camping area. Throughout this time, the whispered conversations never stopped. The voices grew more urgent, more excited, as if they were building toward some kind of climax. I caught fragments of phrases that made my skin crawl. The offering must be willing, blood calls to blood, and God will provide the sacrifice. The religious overtones were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire ordeal. This wasn't just random vandalism or some kind of prank. These people were conducting what seemed to be some form of ritual, and our campsite had somehow become the focal point of their activities. As the night wore on, I began to notice a pattern to their movements. The footsteps and voices would circle our campsite 3 times, pause for several minutes of intense whispering, then repeat the circuit. During each pause, I could hear more carving, more scratching in the dirt, more evidence that they were transforming our peaceful camping spot into something else entirely. The temperature inside the tent seemed to drop even further, though I couldn't tell if that was due to the natural cooling of the night air, or the sheer terror that had settled into my bones. Mia had gone completely silent, her body pressed against mine in desperate search of comfort and protection. I could feel her tears soaking through my t-shirt as she cried silently, trying not to make any sound that might draw attention to us. Around 4 a.m., just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the activities outside our tent finally ceased. The whispered conversations faded away, and the footsteps retreated deeper into the forest. We lay there in terrified silence for another hour, afraid to move or speak, waiting for any sign that our tormentors might return. Only when full daylight had broken through the forest canopy did we finally dare to emerge from our tent. The morning light revealed a scene that defied rational explanation. Our peaceful campsite had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Every tree within a 50-foot radius bore carved symbols, intricate designs that had been cut deep into the bark with what must have been extremely sharp tools. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen, combining geometric patterns with organic curves in ways that hurt to look at directly. Around our fire pit, someone had drawn an elaborate pattern in the dirt, using what appeared to be a mixture of ash and some dark substance I didn't want to identify. The design was roughly circular, with multiple intersecting lines and symbols that seemed to radiate outward from the center where our fire had been. Small piles of what looked like animal bones were placed at specific points around the perimeter. But the most disturbing discovery was on our tent itself. Where the person had been scratching for so long during the night, they had used what appeared to be blood to paint a complex symbol directly onto the nylon fabric. The design was about the size of a dinner plate, positioned exactly where Mia's head had been while she slept. It consisted of 4 interlocking circles surrounding a central cross, with additional lines and markings that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them too closely. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Mia whispered, her face pale as parchment as she stared at the blood-red symbol. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold onto the tent flap she'd been using to steady herself. The smell hit us next, a cloying metallic odor that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't just the blood on our tent, but something else, something organic and wrong that seemed to permeate the entire campsite. Mixed with the pine scent and wood smoke was an underlying stench of decay and something I could only describe as corruption. As we moved around the campsite, documenting the damage and trying to understand what had been done to our peaceful retreat, we discovered more disturbing details. Our food supplies had been carefully arranged in patterns that mirrored the symbols carved into the trees. Our water bottles had been emptied and refilled with a dark liquid that reeked of iron and something far worse. Most chilling of all were the footprints. In the soft earth around our tent, we could clearly see the impressions of at least 6 different pairs of boots, all adult-sized, that had walked in deliberate patterns throughout the night. The prints led away from our campsite deeper into the forest, following a path that seemed to head directly toward the steepest, most inaccessible part of the mountain. I took photos of everything with my phone, though part of me wondered if anyone would believe what we'd experienced. The symbols, the patterns, the evidence of organized activity. It all looked like something from a movie rather than reality. But the blood on our tent was real. The carved trees were real, and the terror that still coursed through my veins was undeniably real. "We have to get out of here," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now. We have to leave everything and go." She was right, of course. But years of camping had ingrained in me the habit of leaving no trace, of cleaning up our campsite before departure. Even in my state of terror, I found myself hesitating, thinking about the expensive tent and camping gear we would be abandoning. "Forget the stuff," Mia said, seeing my hesitation. "None of it matters. We need to get to the car and drive away from here as fast as possible." The urgency in her voice snapped me out of my indecision. We threw our essential items, phones, keys, wallets, into our backpacks and left everything else behind. The tent, sleeping bags, camping stove, even Mia's beloved telescope, all of it stayed in that cursed clearing as we ran for our car. The Honda started on the first try, and I had never been so grateful to hear an engine turn over. As we bounced and crashed down the rough dirt road, branches scraping against the windows, I kept checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The forest looked peaceful in the morning light, giving no indication of the horror that had unfolded just hours earlier. It wasn't until we reached the main highway and were speeding down the mountain toward civilization that either of us spoke again. "What were those symbols?" Mia asked, her voice still trembling. "What did they want with us?" I had no answers, but I knew we needed to report what had happened to someone in authority. The question was who would believe such an incredible story. The Mount Shasta Ranger Station was a modest building situated at the base of the mountain, surrounded by informational displays about local wildlife and hiking safety. We arrived there just after 8 a.m., both of us still in our rumpled camping clothes and probably looking like we'd seen a ghost, which in a way we had. Ranger Tom Mitchell was a weathered man in his 50s with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending decades outdoors. His initial expression was one of polite concern as we approached his desk. But as I began recounting our experience, his demeanor shifted dramatically. "Wait a minute," he interrupted when I described the symbol painted on our tent. "You said 4 circles with a cross in the center?" I nodded, pulling out my phone to show him the photos I'd taken. The moment he saw the image, his face went completely white. He stared at the screen for nearly a full minute before looking up at us with an expression of grim recognition. "You're not the first," he said quietly, gesturing for us to sit in the chairs beside his desk. "In fact, you're the 3rd couple to report almost exactly this same experience in the past 2 months." My stomach dropped. "The 3rd?" Ranger Mitchell pulled out a thick file folder from his desk drawer and spread several incident reports across the surface. Each report contained photographs that were eerily similar to what we'd experienced. Carved symbols in trees, elaborate patterns drawn in dirt, and in each case the same 4-circle design painted in what appeared to be blood. "The first incident happened in early September," he explained, pointing to a report dated 2 months earlier. "A couple from Sacramento, both experienced hikers, found themselves surrounded by people whispering in the woods just like you described. They found similar symbols the next morning and came straight here, just like you did." "What happened to them?" Mia asked. Though from the ranger's expression, I suspected we weren't going to like the answer. "They decided to stay another night," Mitchell said grimly. Thought it might have been some kind of elaborate prank by local kids. I advised against it strongly. Told them to head home immediately, but they were convinced it was just harassment and wanted to stand their ground. He pulled out another set of photographs, these showing a campsite that looked like a war zone. The tent was slashed to ribbons, camping equipment scattered and destroyed, and dark stains covered the ground in patterns that made my skin crawl. The man, Gregory Walsh, came back the next morning alone. He was nearly catatonic, kept repeating that they took her into the mountain. His girlfriend, Samantha Chen, was gone. We found her torn nightgown about 2 miles deeper into the forest, along with— He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Along with what? I pressed. Along with evidence that she hadn't gone willingly. There was blood, lots of it, and signs of a struggle that lasted for quite some distance. We launched a full search and rescue operation, brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteer searchers. We combed every inch of the mountain for 3 weeks. Did you find her? Mia whispered. Ranger Mitchell shook his head. Not a trace. It's like she vanished into thin air once they got her deep enough into the wilderness. Gregory was no help. He'd either blocked out the trauma or genuinely didn't remember anything after hearing her scream. The second incident report was even more disturbing. A pair of college students from Portland had experienced the same pattern of nighttime visitors, the same symbols, the same terrifying ritual activities. Unlike the first couple, they had fled immediately upon discovering the markings, but they had also provided more detailed descriptions of what they'd overheard. Listen to this, Mitchell said, reading from their statement. They kept talking about preparing offerings for something they called the Mountain Father. They mentioned needing to complete a cycle of sacrifices before the winter solstice. That's less than 2 months away now. The implications were horrifying. We weren't dealing with random vandals or even ordinary cultists. This was an organized group with specific goals and a timeline for achieving them. Worse, they seemed to be escalating their activities with each incident. Have you contacted the FBI? I asked. This sounds like it could be connected to other missing persons cases. We've been working with state and federal authorities, Mitchell confirmed. But the problem is jurisdiction and evidence. These people seem to know exactly how to operate in the gaps between different law enforcement agencies. They pick isolated locations that are technically in wilderness areas where response times are measured in hours, not minutes. He showed us a map marked with red X's indicating locations where similar symbols had been found over the past year. The pattern was chilling. A rough circle around Mount Shasta with our campsite forming nearly the exact center of the formation. Based on what we've pieced together from various reports, we believe there's a group of at least 10 to 15 people involved. They seem to be conducting some kind of ritual that requires specific locations and timing. Your campsite appears to have been selected as a key point in whatever they're planning. The thought that we'd been targeted, that our romantic getaway had been deliberately chosen by these people, made me feel physically sick. How long had they been watching us? Had they followed us up the mountain, or had they already been there waiting? The next few weeks passed in a haze of police interviews, FBI consultations, and sleepless nights. Agent Rivera from the Bureau's Sacramento field office was assigned to coordinate the investigation, and she proved to be both thorough and sympathetic to our ordeal. Under her guidance, we worked with a sketch artist to recreate the symbols we'd seen, provided detailed timelines of the events, and even underwent hypnosis sessions to see if we could recall additional details. The hypnosis sessions were particularly disturbing. Under guided relaxation, I found myself remembering aspects of that night that my conscious mind had apparently blocked out. I recalled seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees, their faces obscured by dark hoods that seemed to absorb the moonlight. More chilling still, I remembered hearing what sounded like chanting in a language I couldn't identify, with a rhythm that seemed designed to induce a trance-like state. Mia's hypnosis sessions revealed even more troubling details. She remembered the person outside our tent speaking directly to her, whispering her name through the fabric wall in a voice that seemed to know intimate details about her life. The hypnotist had to bring her out of the session early when she began having what appeared to be a panic attack, her body convulsing as she relived the terror of that night. Agent Rivera's investigation had uncovered disturbing connections to similar incidents across the western United States. Over the past 5 years, there had been reports of ritual activities in wilderness areas from Northern California to Oregon and Washington. The common elements were always the same: isolated campsites, nighttime visitors who left elaborate symbolic markings, and in several cases missing persons who were never found. We believe we're dealing with what's called a syncretic cult, Rivera explained during one of our meetings at the FBI field office. They combine elements from various religious and occult traditions, often focusing on concepts of sacrifice and communion with natural or supernatural forces. She showed us crime scene photos from other incidents that made our experience look almost tame by comparison. Campsites where tents had been arranged in ritual patterns, fire pits filled with animal remains, and trees carved with symbols so extensive they looked like ancient runestones. Most disturbing were the photographs of personal items left behind by missing persons. Clothes, jewelry, and personal effects arranged in deliberate patterns that seemed to have religious significance. The good news, Rivera continued, is that you survived your encounter, which gives us more intelligence about their methods than we've had before. The bad news is that your testimony suggests they're escalating towards something much more serious than harassment. The FBI had established a joint task force with local law enforcement agencies, and they were conducting regular patrols of the areas where incidents had occurred. But the vastness of the wilderness made comprehensive coverage impossible, and the perpetrators seemed to have intimate knowledge of the terrain that allowed them to appear and disappear at will. Meanwhile, Mia and I were struggling to return to any semblance of normal life. She had taken a leave of absence from work, unable to concentrate on design projects when her mind was constantly replaying the events of that night. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, checking and rechecking the locks on our apartment door, and lying awake for hours listening for footsteps that never came. We had moved in together immediately after the incident, neither of us able to bear being alone. Even so, the apartment felt unsafe, too exposed, too vulnerable. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and every stranger on the street made us wonder if they might be connected to the group that had terrorized us. The worst part was the dreams. Both of us were experiencing vivid nightmares that seemed to pick up where our camping experience had left off. In my dreams, I was always running through endless forests, pursued by hooded figures whose faces remained hidden in shadow. The dreams felt incredibly real, complete with physical sensations of branches tearing at my clothes and roots catching my feet. Mia's nightmares were even more specific and disturbing. She dreamed repeatedly of being dragged from our tent by invisible hands, pulled through the forest toward a clearing where robed figures waited around a massive bonfire. The dreams always ended the same way, with her lying on a stone altar while the hooded figures chanted in that unknown language we'd heard whispered outside our tent. It has been 3 months since our ordeal at Mount Shasta, and I wish I could say that time has lessened the impact of what we experienced. The truth is far more disturbing. Not only do the memories refuse to fade, but we've begun to suspect that our encounter with those mysterious figures may have been just the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying. The FBI investigation has yielded frustratingly few concrete results. Despite extensive searches of the areas around Mount Shasta, no physical evidence of the group has been found beyond the symbols and markings that continue to appear at various locations throughout the region. It's as if the people responsible possess an almost supernatural ability to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only the evidence of their ritual activities. Agent Rivera has kept us informed of the investigation's progress, and what she's shared has only deepened our sense of dread. The pattern of incidents has expanded beyond Northern California, with similar reports now coming from wilderness areas in Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado. Each incident follows the same template: isolated campers, nighttime visitors, elaborate symbolic markings, and in an increasing number of cases, missing persons who simply disappear into the vast wilderness. More troubling still are the reports from other survivors who, like us, escaped their initial encounter only to find themselves experiencing ongoing harassment. Phone calls in the middle of the night where no one speaks but breathing can be heard. Packages delivered to their homes containing animal bones arranged in ritual patterns. Photographs of their daily activities taken from impossible angles, as if someone was watching them constantly from hiding places that shouldn't exist. We've experienced some of these phenomena ourselves. Last month, Mia found a small pile of bird bones arranged in the shape of that familiar four-circle symbol on our apartment balcony. Security cameras in our building showed no one entering or leaving the area, yet the bones were definitely placed there deliberately. The building manager suggested it might have been an elaborate prank, but the bones were arranged with the same precision and purpose we'd seen in the forest. 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call at 3 a.m., the same time we'd first been awakened by the footsteps outside our tent. No one spoke when I answered, but I could hear that same rhythmic chanting we'd heard in the forest. faint but unmistakable in the background. The call lasted exactly 4 minutes before disconnecting, and when I tried to call back, the number was listed as out of service. Most disturbing of all was the incident that occurred just last week. Mia was walking home from her therapy appointment when she noticed a man in a dark hoodie following her. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but he maintained the same distance behind her for 6 blocks, turning when she turned, stopping when she stopped. When she finally worked up the courage to look back directly at him, he was gone, vanished as completely as if he'd never been there at all. The psychological toll has been enormous. Both of us are in therapy now, working with a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma related to cult activities. Dr. Martinez has been helpful in giving us coping strategies for the anxiety and hypervigilance that have become constant companions, but even she seems troubled by some of the details we've shared. In most cases of cult harassment, she explained during one session, the perpetrators eventually lose interest in former victims and move on to new targets. The persistence you're describing is unusual and suggests a level of organization and purpose that's quite rare in these types of groups. The research I've conducted on my own has been equally disturbing. Using the photos of the symbols we encountered, I've been able to trace connections to historical accounts of ritual practices that date back centuries. The 4-circle design, in particular, appears in medieval texts describing practices that were considered so dangerous that entire communities would be abandoned if evidence of them was discovered. According to these historical accounts, the symbols we saw were used to mark locations for what was called the Great Offering, a ritual that supposedly required specific geographical conditions and astronomical alignments to achieve its purpose. Mount Shasta, with its unique geological properties and position relative to other landmarks, appears to match the criteria described in these ancient texts with disturbing precision. The worst part is the growing certainty that what we experienced was not an ending but a beginning. The investigation has revealed that ritual activity in the Mount Shasta region has been increasing steadily over the past several years, building toward what appears to be a significant event planned for the upcoming winter solstice. Based on the pattern of incidents and the escalating nature of the group's activities, law enforcement believes they may be planning something catastrophic. We've been advised to relocate, to change our names and disappear into the witness protection system until the threat has been neutralized. But the truth is, I don't think distance will protect us from whatever these people have planned. The symbols, the rituals, the carefully orchestrated harassment, it all suggests a level of knowledge and capability that transcends ordinary criminal activity. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, I wonder if we were ever supposed to escape that forest at all. Perhaps we were allowed to leave, to serve as witnesses or unwitting participants in some larger design that we're only beginning to understand. The thought that we might be carrying some invisible mark that connects us to their plans is terrifying beyond description. As I write this, sitting in our heavily secured apartment with deadbolts on every door and security cameras monitoring every entrance, I can hear Mia crying softly in the bedroom. She's been having the dreams again. The same visions of being dragged through the forest toward that altar of stone. But lately the dreams have been changing, becoming more specific and detailed, as if something is preparing her for an inevitable return to that place of horror. The winter solstice is now less than 6 weeks away. Whatever those people in the forest were preparing for, whatever ritual they've been building toward with their symbols and sacrifices, the time for its completion is approaching rapidly. And despite all our precautions, all our security measures and police protection, I have the growing certainty that when that time comes, they will find us. The evil that lurks in those woods, that claims innocent lives in service to God knows what dark purpose, is patient and methodical in ways that defy human understanding. Our escape from Mount Shasta wasn't a victory. It was merely a postponement of something that was always meant to be. The terror that began in that forest clearing has become a permanent part of our lives, a shadow that grows longer and darker with each passing day. And as the solstice approaches, as the days grow shorter and the nights longer, I find myself wondering not if they will come for us again, but when. In the depths of the wilderness, ancient evils stir and hungry gods wait for their promised sacrifices. We were marked that night in ways we're only beginning to understand, and the mark once placed can never be removed. The mountain remembers, and it will call us home. I'm 50 years old now, and I've been witnessing things that would make most people question their sanity since I was 11 or 12 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened during 2000 and 2001, when I made what I thought would be the best decision of my life, moving to the Manzano Rocky Mountains near Albuquerque. The house was a log cap and tongue and groove kit construction, positioned at the very back corner of Cibola National Forest. When I say back corner, I mean I was essentially living at the edge of civilization. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away through winding mountain roads that became impassable during heavy snowfall. The house itself was an architectural oddity. One side of the roof featured standard asphalt shingles, while the other was constructed with heavy cement tiles that created an distinctive hollow sound when anything walked across them. My only companion was my black lab, a loyal animal whose instincts I had learned to trust over the years. The isolation appealed to me initially. After years of city living, the silence felt like a blessing. The air was clean, the views were spectacular, and I believed I had found my personal sanctuary. What I discovered instead was that true isolation can become a prison when you realize you're not as alone as you thought. The winters in that elevation were brutal beyond anything I had experienced. Temperatures would drop to 2 degrees Fahrenheit and remain there from November through April. Snow would accumulate in depths that defied comprehension. I purchased a standard yardstick specifically to measure the snow depth, thinking it would be adequate. The first time I attempted to use it, I watched it disappear completely into what appeared to be level ground, not even a drift against the house. I had to turn my head sideways and plunge my entire arm into the snow just to retrieve the measuring stick. That was when I understood I was living in a place where nature followed different rules. The sounds began approximately 3 weeks after I had settled into what I thought would be my peaceful mountain routine. It started as subtle creaking and settling noises that I attributed to the house adjusting to temperature fluctuations. Log construction expands and contracts significantly, and I convinced myself that was the explanation for the occasional groaning sounds that seemed to come from the roof structure. But these sounds had characteristics that house settling simply couldn't explain. They occurred at irregular intervals, always during the evening hours between sunset and midnight. More disturbing was their location. They seemed to originate from directly above my living area, moving in patterns that suggested deliberate movement rather than random structural adjustment. The first time I heard what I can only describe as scratching sounds against the cement tiles, I was reading by the fireplace. The noise was distinct, sharp, deliberate scraping that created a rhythm unlike anything wind or settling timber could produce. My black lab, who had been sleeping peacefully beside my chair, immediately lifted his head and began a low, continuous growl that raised the hair on my arms. His ears were pinned back and his entire body had gone rigid with tension. I stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the roofline and surrounding trees for any obvious explanation. The beam revealed nothing unusual. No fallen branches, no animals visible in the nearby pines, no ice formations that might be shifting and creating the sounds. But standing there in the freezing air, I became acutely aware of how completely silent the forest had become. No wind through the trees, no distant sounds of wildlife, nothing but my own breathing and the rapid beating of my heart. When I returned inside, the scratching had stopped. My dog remained alert for another hour, occasionally whimpering and staring at the ceiling. That night marked the beginning of my growing awareness that something was sharing my mountain sanctuary, something that preferred to move under cover of darkness. Over the following weeks, the disturbances escalated in both frequency and intensity. What had begun as occasional scratching evolved into sounds that defied any rational explanation I could construct. The thing, and I had begun thinking of it as a specific entity rather than random wildlife, seemed to be getting bolder, or perhaps more comfortable with my presence. The most unsettling development was the sound of what could only be described as claws gripping and releasing the cement tiles. Each footstep produced a distinct sequence. The initial contact of claws against tile, followed by the grinding sound of those claws finding purchase, then the hollow thump of significant weight settling onto the roof structure. The entire house would vibrate with each impact, causing windows to rattle in their frames and dishes to shift in cabinets. I began carrying my .41 Magnum revolver with me at all times, both inside the house and during my ventures outside. The weapon was an older caliber, more comfortable to handle than a .44 Magnum but significantly more powerful than a .357. The weight of it against my hip provided some psychological comfort, though I harbored serious doubts about its effectiveness against whatever was causing these disturbances. My evening routine had changed completely. Instead of relaxing by the fire, I found myself sitting in darkness, listening and trying to predict when the next series of sounds would begin. The pattern seemed random at first, but gradually I began to detect a schedule. The entity typically arrived sometime between 8 and 10 in the evening, spent anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour moving across the roof, then departed as suddenly as it had arrived. The most terrifying aspect was the sheer size that the footsteps suggested. Based on the spacing between impacts and the force with which each step struck the roof, I estimated that whatever was up there had to be significantly larger than any wildlife native to the area. Bears were certainly present in the national forest, but even a large black bear couldn't produce the methodical, purposeful movement patterns I was hearing. My sleep became fractured and restless. Even when the sounds weren't occurring, I lay awake anticipating them, my body tensed and ready to respond to the first scratch or thump. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like vulnerability. Desperation and curiosity eventually overcame my caution. I decided to conduct a systematic investigation to determine what was causing these nightly visits. During daylight hours, I examined every inch of the roof that I could access safely, looking for any evidence of the nocturnal visitor. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The cement tiles showed clear signs of contact, scratches and small chips that formed patterns consistent with large claws gripping the surface. The damage was fresh and extensive, covering areas that would require an animal of considerable size to create. But there were no other traces, no fur caught on rough edges, no droppings, no scent markings that might indicate what type of creature was responsible. I expanded my search to the surrounding ground, looking for tracks in the snow and mud near the house. The results were inconsistent and puzzling. Occasionally I would find what appeared to be partial impressions in soft earth near the foundation, but they were never clear enough to identify definitively. The size suggested something much larger than any known local wildlife, but the depth and spacing made no sense according to my understanding of animal locomotion. I also began timing the visits more precisely, keeping a log of when the sounds began, how long they lasted, and any patterns in the movement across the roof. The entity seemed to favor the section above my bedroom and living area, spending extended periods in those locations before moving to other parts of the structure. The routes it took were consistent, suggesting familiarity with the roof layout. Most disturbing was my growing suspicion that the visits were becoming more frequent and lasting longer each time. What had initially been brief, seemingly random occurrences were evolving into extended sessions that sometimes lasted well past midnight. The scratching and movement had also become more aggressive, as if the entity was becoming frustrated or impatient with something. During one particularly bold daylight investigation, I climbed onto a section of the roof to examine the damage more closely. Standing up there, looking out over the vast expanse of forest that surrounded my property, I was struck by how completely isolated I truly was. If something happened to me, how long would it be before anyone noticed my absence? The nearest road was barely visible through the trees, and during winter storms, even that connection to civilization could be severed for days at a time. My friend Graham had been planning to visit for several weeks, and I found myself both anticipating and dreading his arrival. Part of me desperately wanted a witness to validate what I had been experiencing, but another part feared that the entity would remain dormant during his stay, leaving me to appear paranoid and delusional. Graham arrived on a Friday afternoon, bringing with him the skepticism I had expected. When I described the nightly disturbances, he listened with the patience of someone humoring a friend's eccentric claims. His explanation was predictable. The sounds were obviously caused by snow and ice shifting on the roof, combined with the natural settling of a log structure and extreme temperature variations. My imagination, shaped by isolation and too much solitude, had transformed ordinary house sounds into something sinister. I didn't argue with his assessment. I preferred to let the situation speak for itself. That first evening, we sat in the living room playing cards and drinking coffee. Graham was relaxed and talkative, sharing news from the city and catching up on months of separation. I found his presence comforting, even as I remained alert for the familiar sounds that typically began around 8 o'clock. At approximately 9:15, the first scratching began directly overhead. Graham's conversation stopped mid-sentence, as the unmistakable sound of claws gripping cement tiles echoed through the room. His expression shifted from casual confidence to alert concern as the house began its familiar trembling with each massive footstep. The entity seemed particularly active that night, moving back and forth across the roof with an energy and persistence I hadn't witnessed before. Each impact was sharp and deliberate, accompanied by the grinding sound of claws finding purchase on the cement surface. Graham sat frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the sounds tracked directly overhead from one end of the house to the other. When I reached for my .41 Magnum, Graham immediately drew his own weapon, a small .25 caliber pistol that suddenly seemed inadequate for whatever was causing the disturbance above us. We sat there armed and tense, listening to the methodical pacing that continued for nearly 45 minutes before ending as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt heavy and ominous. Graham looked at me with a mixture of apology and fear, no longer questioning the reality of what I had been experiencing. Whatever was up there was real, it was large, and it was becoming increasingly bold in its nightly visits. Following Graham's departure, the entity's behavior changed dramatically. The visits became nightly occurrences, and the duration increased significantly. What had previously been brief episodes lasting 15 to 30 minutes now stretched on for hours. The sounds also became more varied and disturbing, including what I can only describe as deliberate testing of the roof structure. I began to hear periodic impacts that seemed designed to test the strength of the cement tiles and underlying support beams. These weren't the normal footsteps I had grown accustomed to, but focused strikes against specific areas, as if the entity was probing for weak points. The house would shake with these impacts, and I could hear individual tiles shifting and cracking under the pressure. My black lab's behavior became increasingly erratic during these episodes. He would pace anxiously throughout the house, whimpering and occasionally barking at the ceiling. On several occasions, he refused to go outside for his normal evening routine, backing away from the door and retreating to the furthest corner of the house. His instincts were clearly warning him of danger that exceeded my own understanding. The most terrifying development was the entity's apparent awareness of my location within the house. When I moved from room to room, the sounds would follow, tracking my movement with precision that suggested intelligence and intent. If I sat reading in the living room, the heaviest activity would occur directly overhead. When I moved to the kitchen, the sounds would shift to that section of the roof. This behavioral change eliminated any remaining possibility that I was dealing with random wildlife. The tracking behavior, the deliberate testing of structural elements, and the increased frequency of visits all suggested something that was studying me, learning my routines, and possibly planning some form of direct contact. Sleep became impossible during these extended visits. I would lie in bed listening to the entity moving back and forth above my bedroom, sometimes stopping for long periods directly overhead before resuming its methodical pacing. The weight distribution suggested something that walked upright rather than on all fours, a detail that added a new dimension to my fear. On multiple occasions, I came close to firing through the roof. The temptation to put a 210-grain bullet through the ceiling and into whatever was causing these disturbances was almost overwhelming. Only practical concerns prevented me from taking that action. The roof structure might slow the bullet enough to merely wound rather than stop the entity, and an injured, angry creature of that apparent size could easily tear through the roof to reach me. The entity's boldness reached a new level when it began visiting the deck that extended 50 feet along the back of the house. These encounters were far more immediate and threatening than the roof visits, occurring while I was outside smoking and enjoying the mountain air. The first deck encounter happened on a clear, cold evening in late January. I was standing near the railing, looking out over the snow-covered forest, when I heard the unmistakable sound of something large landing on the opposite end of the deck. The impact was substantial enough to make the entire structure vibrate, and I could hear the wooden boards creaking under significant weight. What followed was the most terrifying experience of my time in the mountains. Whatever had landed on the deck began moving toward my position, and it covered the entire 50-foot length in approximately 4 steps. Even allowing for exaggeration due to fear and adrenaline, I knew that no human being could cover that distance in so few strides. I am 6 feet tall and weigh 220 pounds, and even my longest possible steps wouldn't come close to matching that coverage. The sound of each footstep was distinct and heavy, accompanied by the slight flexing of deck boards under enormous weight. Between steps, I could hear what sounded like claws tapping against the wooden surface, creating a rhythm that suggested patience rather than aggression. The entity was taking its time, moving deliberately rather than rushing toward confrontation. I drew my .41 Magnum and backed toward the house, keeping the weapon trained on the area where I estimated the entity to be. The darkness beyond my porch light was complete, revealing nothing that might explain the sounds and movement I was experiencing. But something was definitely there, something large enough to make the deck shake with each step and intelligent enough to approach with calculated patience. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The entity seemed to stop approximately 10 feet from my position, remaining stationary for what felt like an eternity before retreating in the same deliberate manner it had approached. I listened to it move back across the deck and apparently depart, though I couldn't determine the direction of its exit. These deck encounters became a regular feature of my evening routine, occurring 3 or 4 times per week. Each time the pattern was similar. The entity would arrive via some method I couldn't observe, cross the deck in those impossibly long strides, pause near my position, then retreat. The consistency suggested this was not random predatory behavior but something more purposeful, observation perhaps, or evaluation. By March of 2001, the situation had become untenable. The nightly visits had evolved from a disturbing mystery into a source of constant stress that was affecting my health and sanity. Sleep deprivation, combined with the persistent anxiety of never knowing when the next encounter would occur, had left me physically and emotionally exhausted. The final incident that convinced me to leave occurred on a particularly cold night in early spring. I was awakened around midnight by sounds unlike anything I had previously experienced. Instead of the familiar scratching and pacing, I heard what could only be described as systematic destruction. The entity was apparently removing cement tiles from the roof, dropping them to the ground with crashes that shook the entire house. I armed myself and moved through the house, trying to determine exactly what was happening overhead. The sound suggested that whatever was up there was creating an opening in the roof structure, possibly attempting to gain entry to the house itself. The methodical nature of the work, tile removal followed by what sounded like structural damage, indicated a level of intelligence and purpose that exceeded anything I had previously witnessed. The activity continued for nearly 2 hours, during which time I remained armed and alert, prepared for the possibility that my nocturnal visitor might succeed in breaching the roof. My black lab was nearly frantic with fear, pacing and whimpering throughout the house in a state of agitation I had never seen before. When morning came and the sounds finally ceased, I climbed onto the roof to assess the damage. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Several cement tiles had been carefully removed and set aside, and the underlying structure showed clear signs of deliberate manipulation. Claw marks in the wooden supports indicated that whatever had done this possessed both the size and strength to modify the building structure according to its needs. That discovery made my decision inevitable. Within 2 weeks, I had arranged to terminate my lease and relocate back to a more populated area. The mountains had offered solitude and natural beauty, but they had also provided something I had never expected and couldn't continue to endure. I never did see the entity that had made my year in the mountains such a trial of fear and endurance. In retrospect, I'm grateful for that small mercy. Some things are better left unseen, existing only in memory as sounds and evidence rather than direct visual confirmation. The human imagination, disturbing as it can be, might actually be preferable to the reality of what was sharing that isolated corner of the Cibola National Forest. Even now, more than 20 years later, I occasionally wake in the night listening for the familiar scratch of claws against roofing material. The experience taught me that isolation, while appealing in theory, can expose us to aspects of the natural world that we're not prepared to understand or confront. Some places are wild for reasons that extend beyond simple geography, and some forms of wildlife operate according to rules that challenge our comfortable assumptions about the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. I still carry that .41 Magnum, and I still remember the weight of it in my hand during those long nights of listening and waiting. But mostly, I remember the lesson that true solitude is an illusion, and that in the deepest wilderness you're never really alone. Sometimes that's a comfort. Sometimes it's the most terrifying realization you can have. My name is Charles Robinson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September of 2010, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. It's about as wild and rugged a place as you can find in the lower 48. I'd seen my share of grizzlies and mountain lions over the years, but those encounters were straightforward, predictable. What I faced back then, there's no guidebook for that. The call came in on a crisp autumn morning. The air had that particular bite to it, hinting at the winter to come. I was in the ranger station, going through my usual morning routine, checking weather reports, trail conditions, and any overnight incident logs. The radio crackled to life, breaking the quiet.
Base, this is dispatch. We've got a report of a missing hiker near Iceberg Lake. Group of 5, one member unaccounted for since yesterday afternoon. Over.
I grabbed the radio. Dispatch. This is Ranger Robinson. I copy. Any more details? Over. Negative, Ranger. Group's pretty shaken up. They're waiting at the Iceberg Lake trailhead. Ranger Hayes is already en route to meet you there. Over. 10-4 dispatch. I'm heading out now. Over and out. I quickly gathered my gear. First aid kit, extra water, emergency rations, and my trusty 30-06 rifle. In bear country, you never leave without it. As I headed out to my truck, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Missing hikers weren't uncommon, but something about this call felt different. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour. The road wound through towering pines and past crystal clear streams. On any other day, I would have marveled at the beauty. Today, my mind was focused on the task at hand. I pulled into the parking lot and saw Amelia Hayes, my partner for this operation, already talking to a group of visibly distressed hikers. Amelia was relatively new to the job, but she had good instincts and a level head. I grabbed my pack and joined them. Charles. Amelia nodded as I approached. This is Mike, Sarah, Tom, and Lisa. Their friend John has been missing since yesterday afternoon. I looked at the group. They were in their mid-20s, dressed in decent hiking gear but with the slightly overwhelmed look of city folks out of their element. Can you tell me exactly what happened? I asked. Mike, a tall guy with a scraggly beard, spoke up. We were about 2 miles past Iceberg Lake, exploring some of the unmarked trails. John was a little ahead of us, maybe 50 yards. He went around a bend in the path, and then Mike's voice cracked. Sarah, a petite blonde with red-rimmed eyes, continued. We heard this sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a growl. Then John yelled, just once. By the time we got around the bend, he was gone. Just gone. Did you see any signs of what might have taken him? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. Tom, a stocky guy with glasses, shook his head. It happened so fast. We saw some disturbed underbrush, maybe a flash of movement deeper in the woods, but nothing clear. I exchanged a glance with Amelia. This wasn't sounding like a typical bear attack or a hiker simply getting lost. Did you notice anything unusual in the area before John disappeared? Any strange noises, smells, tracks? The group looked at each other uneasily. Finally, Lisa, a tall woman with long dark hair, spoke up. There was something off about the woods there. It was too quiet. No bird sounds, no squirrels. And there was this smell, like rotting meat. But also something else. Something I can't describe. I nodded, trying not to let my growing concern show on my face. All right, here's what we're going to do. Amelia and I are going to head up the trail and see if we can find any sign of John. I need you all to stay here. If we're not back in 4 hours, use the emergency radio in my truck to call for backup. Understood? They nodded, looking relieved to have professionals taking over. As Amelia and I started up the trail, I could feel their eyes on our backs, full of hope and fear. The hike to Iceberg Lake was beautiful but tense. Neither of us spoke much, our senses on high alert for any sign of trouble. The lake itself was a stunning sight, a sheet of turquoise water surrounded by towering cliffs. But we didn't have time to admire the view. We pushed on past the lake, following the faint trail the hikers had described. About 2 miles in, we started to notice changes. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and it was quiet. Too quiet. Charles, Amelia whispered, do you smell that? I nodded grimly. The air had taken on a foul odor, just as Lisa had described. Like decay, but with an underlying scent that made my skin crawl. We pressed on, moving slowly, our eyes scanning the woods around us. That's when we found the first sign of John. A scrap of cloth caught on a thorny bush. It was stained with what could only be blood. Amelia bagged it as evidence, her hands shaking slightly. We followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. Whatever had taken John, it was big, and it hadn't been subtle about its passage. The trail led us deeper into the woods, away from any marked paths. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The towering pines blocked out most of the sunlight, creating an eerie twilight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. Charles, Amelia said. her voice tense. "What do you think we're dealing with here? This doesn't feel like any animal attack I've ever seen." I shook my head. "I don't know, Amelia. In all my years as a ranger, I've never seen anything like this. But whatever it is, we need to find it before it hurts anyone else." We pushed on, the sense of wrongness growing with each step. The smell was getting stronger, and now there was something else. A sound, just at the edge of hearing, like breathing, but wrong. Too deep, too rhythmic for any animal I knew. As we rounded a bend in our makeshift trail, we came upon a clearing. What we saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, like a nest made of broken branches and bones. Animal bones, mostly, but some looked disturbingly human. And there, half buried in the nest, was a backpack. John's backpack. Amelia started forward, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I whispered. "Look." At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, was something. It was tall, much taller than a man, with limbs that seemed too long, too jointed. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, like the moss on the trees around us. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow-green in the gloom, fixed right on us. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature moved, faster than anything that size had a right to. It lunged across the clearing, those impossibly long arms reaching for us. I shoved Amelia to one side and dove the other way, bringing my rifle up as I rolled. I fired, the sound deafening in the quiet forest. The creature shrieked, a sound that made my bones vibrate, and stumbled back. "Run," I yelled to Amelia. We took off, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear the creature behind us, its inhuman shrieks echoing through the trees. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs felt like lead. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail, nearly colliding with a group of startled hikers. "Call for backup," I gasped, gesturing wildly at their satellite phone. "Emergency." As one of the hikers made the call, Amelia and I turned to face the woods, our weapons ready. But the creature didn't emerge. The forest was silent once more. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Park rangers and local law enforcement swarmed the area. Search parties were organized. But despite an extensive search, no trace of John was ever found. And the creature, well, the official report chalked it up to a bear attack. Said Amelia and I had been confused, stressed, seeing things that weren't there. But I know what I saw. That thing in the woods. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything natural. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that breathing again, just outside my window. That deep rhythmic sound that's almost but not quite human. I retired from the Park Service not long after that incident. Couldn't handle the skeptical looks, the whispers behind my back. Moved down to Arizona. Took up a job as a tour guide in the desert. It's safer here, mostly. No dark forests, no deep shadows for things to hide in. But I can't forget. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll see those glowing eyes again. So I keep my rifle clean and loaded, just in case. Because out there in the wild places, in the deep woods and high mountains, there are things that defy explanation. Things that hunt in the shadows, that prey on the unwary. And all the training in the world can't prepare you for the moment when you realize that you're not the top of the food chain anymore. So if you're ever out in the backcountry, and the forest goes quiet, and you catch a whiff of something rotting on the wind, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just run. Run, and don't look back. Because there are some things in this world that man was never meant to face. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. This is Charles Robinson, former backcountry ranger of Glacier National Park, signing off. Stay safe out there, folks. And always remember, in the wild, you're not always the hunter. Sometimes, you're the prey. My name is Walter Jones, and at 75 years old, I've seen more than my fair share of life's oddities. For the past decade, I've worked as a park ranger in the dense, sprawling forests of northern Minnesota. It's a job that many people romanticize, imagining days filled with peaceful hikes and quiet contemplation among the trees. But let me tell you, it's far from the serene tree-hugging gig most folks picture. Don't get me wrong, I love my job. There's something profoundly satisfying about being a steward of nature, protecting these ancient woods and the creatures that call them home. But it's hard work, often grueling, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally downright terrifying. I've dealt with everything from lost hikers stumbling around in circles, their eyes wide with panic, to raging forest fires that threaten to devour acres of pristine wilderness. I've rescued injured animals, faced down angry bears, and navigated through storms that made the trees groan and crack like they were about to snap in two. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last summer. It was an experience that shook me to my core, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and left me with a bone-deep fear that I carry to this day. I suppose I should start at the beginning. On that fateful morning in late June, the day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer morning that makes you glad to be alive. I woke at dawn, as I always do, my old bones protesting a bit as I swung my legs out of bed. My cabin, a small but cozy affair on the edge of the ranger station, was filled with the soft golden light of early morning. I went through my usual routine, a quick shower to wake myself up, then a cup of strong black coffee as I sat on my porch, listening to the early birds greeting the day. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wild berries. In the distance, I could hear the faint rush of the river that cuts through the heart of the forest. As I sipped my coffee, I mentally ran through my tasks for the day. It was shaping up to be a busy one. There had been reports from some campers about strange noises in the night up near the northern boundary of the park. Now, 9 times out of 10, these reports turn out to be nothing more than the usual forest sounds, a raccoon rummaging for food, or a deer moving through the underbrush. But protocol is protocol, and it was my job to check it out. I finished my coffee, rinsed out the mug, and started gathering my gear. Into my backpack went a first aid kit, extra water, some high-energy snacks, a flashlight, and a detailed map of the area. I clipped my radio to my belt, checked that my Swiss Army knife was in my pocket, and grabbed my trusty walking stick. As I locked up the cabin and headed towards the trail, I paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the forest around me. The towering pines stretched up towards the sky, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. A squirrel chattered indignantly at me from a nearby branch, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed out its staccato rhythm. Little did I know that this ordinary, beautiful morning was the beginning of the most extraordinary and terrifying experience of my life. As I set off down the trail, whistling softly to myself, I had no idea that in just a few hours my understanding of the world would be turned upside down. If I had known what was waiting for me in the depths of the forest, would I have turned back? Would I have called in sick, stayed in my cabin, and let someone else deal with the strange reports? It's a question I've asked myself countless times in the months since that day. But the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that the events of that day changed me forever, leaving me with a story that even now, I'm not sure I fully believe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that morning, to the start of a journey that would lead me into the heart of a mystery as old and deep as the forest itself. The trail I took that morning was one I'd walked 100 times before. It wound its way through the heart of the forest, a narrow path carpeted with pine needles and dappled with sunlight. As I walked, I made mental notes of the forest's condition. It was my job to keep an eye on things, to notice any changes or potential issues. The first hour of my hike was uneventful. I paused occasionally to mark trees or jot down observations in my small weatherproof notebook. The forest was alive with the sounds of summer, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the gentle creaking of branches in the breeze. As I ventured further north towards the area where the campers had reported strange noises, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest around me. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a denser canopy. The underbrush became thicker, making the path narrower and more challenging to navigate. The quality of the light changed too. What had been bright, cheerful sunshine filtering through the leaves now seemed muted and somber. The bird calls that had been so prevalent earlier grew fewer and farther between, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I've spent enough time in these woods to know that forests have moods. They can be welcoming and peaceful one day, foreboding and alien the next. But this was different. There was a tension in the air, a feeling of wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. About 3 hours into my hike, I reached the area where the campers had set up their site. It was a small clearing, not far from a babbling brook that I knew eventually fed into the larger river. The campers were long gone, but they'd left their mark on the place, and not in a good way. I sighed as I surveyed the mess. Discarded food wrappers, a half-collapsed tent they hadn't bothered to pack up, the blackened remains of a campfire that hadn't been properly extinguished. It never ceased to amaze me how people could come to enjoy nature and then treat it with such disrespect. Well, Walter, I muttered to myself, might as well clean this up while you're here. I set about gathering the trash, making a mental note to report the campers if I could identify them from the reservation logs. As I worked, I kept an ear out for any unusual noises, but all I could hear was the gentle gurgle of the nearby stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It wasn't until I had nearly finished cleaning that I noticed something odd. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. I stood still, my eyes scanning the clearing, trying to identify what had caught my attention. Then I saw it. The ground around the campsite was disturbed in a way I had never seen before. Deep, elongated impressions marred the earth, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged across it. These weren't the typical marks left by campers or wildlife. They were too deep, too regular, and they led away from the campsite into the densest part of the forest. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched down to examine the marks more closely. The soil at the edges of the impressions was compressed and smooth, as if whatever had made them had exerted enormous pressure. I reached out to touch one of the marks, and to my surprise, the soil felt cool, much cooler than it should have been on a warm summer day. I stood up slowly, my eyes following the trail of impressions as they disappeared into the underbrush. Every instinct I had developed over years in the wilderness was screaming at me to turn back, to radio for backup, to not venture any further alone. But there was another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the mysteries of the forest, that urged me to follow the trail. For a long moment I stood there, torn between caution and curiosity. In the end, curiosity won out. But I wasn't completely reckless. I pulled out my radio and called back to the ranger station. "Base, this is Walter. Do you copy?" After a moment of static, a familiar voice crackled through. "Go ahead, Walter. This is Rick." "Rick, I'm up at the northern campsite where we had those noise complaints. Found some strange marks on the ground here. I'm going to follow them, see where they lead. Might be out of radio range for a while." There was a pause before Rick responded, his voice tinged with concern. "You sure that's a good idea, Walt? Maybe wait for backup?" I hesitated, looking again at the strange marks. "I'll be fine, Rick. Just a quick look. If I'm not back in radio contact in 2 hours, send someone up, okay?" "All right, Walt. But be careful out there. Something about this doesn't feel right." "Roger that. I'll check in soon." Walter out. I clipped the radio back onto my belt and took a deep breath. With one last look at the familiar campsite behind me, I stepped forward, following the mysterious trail into the unknown depths of the forest. As I pushed through the dense underbrush, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees here were old, their gnarled trunks covered in thick moss. Very little sunlight penetrated the dense canopy overhead, and the air grew noticeably cooler. The trail of impressions continued, clear and unmistakable even in the dim light. Whatever had made them had moved with purpose, following a straight line through the forest regardless of obstacles. I saw places where small trees had been pushed aside or even snapped off at the base. The silence here was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. It was as if all life had fled from this part of the forest. The only sound was my own breathing, and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose meaning in that strange twilight world. But eventually, I emerged into a small clearing, and what I saw there made me stop dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin. But this was no ordinary forest cabin. It was old, incredibly old. The logs that made up its walls were weathered and gray, covered in a thick layer of moss and lichen. The roof sagged ominously, and several of the windows were broken, their jagged edges like teeth in a hungry mouth. But it wasn't the cabin's decrepit state that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the fact that I knew with absolute certainty that this cabin shouldn't be here. I had patrolled this area for years. I knew every trail, every landmark, every structure in these woods, and I had never ever seen this cabin before. As I stood there staring at the impossible cabin, a gust of wind whispered through the clearing, and with it came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help us," it seemed to say. "Help us." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as I could. But something held me there, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a strange, inexplicable sense of duty. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I took a step towards the cabin. Whatever secrets it held, whatever strange force had brought it here, I knew I had to investigate. Little did I know that by crossing that threshold, I was stepping into a mystery that would change my life forever. With each step towards the cabin, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and decay. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, and cobwebs adorned every corner. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with a rusted stove, a rickety table, and a bed frame with a rotted mattress. But it was what lay on the table that caught my attention. A stack of photographs, their edges yellowed with age. With shaking hands I picked them up. The first few showed families, smiling in front of this very cabin. But as I flipped through them, the images became more recent, and the smiles faded. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was the group of campers who had reported the strange noises, their faces contorted in terror. A loud creak from outside made me jump. I pocketed the photos and rushed to the window. What I saw defied explanation. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, was moving through the trees. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid to be human, and its eyes, they glowed with an otherworldly light. I knew I had to leave to report what I'd found, but as I turned to go, I found my path blocked. The tall figure stood in the doorway, its features obscured by shadow save for those glowing eyes. "Who? What are you?" I managed to stammer. The figure didn't respond, at least not in words. Instead, the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of pleas and warnings. "Help us," they seemed to say. "Trapped. Danger. Leave." I backed away, my mind reeling. The figure began to move towards me, its movements smooth and predatory. In a panic, I grabbed the nearest object, an old lantern, and hurled it at the creature. It passed right through, shattering against the wall behind. Taking advantage of the distraction, I dove through the window. Ignoring the sting of broken glass, I ran blindly through the forest, the whispers pursuing me, the sound of unnaturally long limbs moving through the underbrush spurring me on. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Finally, I burst out of the tree line, finding myself back at the campsite where this had all started. My truck was there, a beacon of normality in this insane situation. I fumbled with the keys, glancing back to see the tall figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching. Those glowing eyes were the last thing I saw before I sped away, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I drove straight to the ranger station, bursting in, out of breath and wild-eyed. My colleague Rick looked up in shock. "Walter, what the hell happened to you?" Between gasps, I told him everything. The cabin, the photos, the creature. To his credit, Rick listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each word. "We need to report this," he said when I finished. "Get some backup out there." The next day, we returned to the site with a small team. Rick, a couple of deputies, and myself. The forest seemed even more oppressive than before, the silence absolute. We found the campsite easily enough, but as we pushed deeper into the forest following my directions, something felt off. The path I had taken seemed to twist and turn, leading us in circles. After hours of searching, we found no trace of the cabin. It was as if it had never existed. The deputies were skeptical, exchanging knowing looks. I could see them writing me off as a crazy old man. But then Joel, one of the younger deputies, called out. He'd found something in the underbrush. My heart sank as we gathered around. It was a body, partially decomposed, and it wasn't alone. We found several more, including the missing campers, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder than ever. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. And there, at the edge of our vision, was the tall figure. What happened next was chaos. The creature moved with impossible speed. Joel went down first, the creature's elongated hand, more like a claw, slashing across his throat. We opened fire, but the bullets seemed to pass right through it. "Run!" Rick shouted, grabbing my arm. We fled, the forest itself seeming to work against us, paths twisting and changing. Somehow, we made it back to our vehicles. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse of the creature, standing at the forest's edge, watching. The official investigation turned up nothing. The bodies vanished. The cabin remained unfound. Only the photos I'd taken from the cabin remained as evidence of my experience. I took some time off after that, tried to process everything. But the whispers never truly left me. They haunted my dreams, followed me even when I was awake. Weeks later, Rick and I met up. We talked late into the night, trying to make sense of what had happened. "You think it's over?" Rick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about those eyes." We never spoke of it again, but the experience changed us both. We became more cautious, more aware of the forest's secrets. I stayed on as a ranger, but I never ventured deep into those woods again. Years have passed since that summer, but the memory of that day has never faded. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I still hear those whispers. And occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something tall and thin moving among the trees. The forest holds many secrets, some of which are best left undisturbed. I've come to believe that what we encountered that day was something ancient, something that has always been a part of these woods. A guardian, perhaps, or a predator, or maybe both. I'm an old man now, and my ranger days are behind me, but I still live on the edge of the forest, and I still feel its pull. There are times when I'm tempted to venture back, to seek out that cabin and confront whatever dwells there. But then I remember those glowing eyes, and the terror in the faces of those photographs, and I stay put. To this day, I'm not sure if what I experienced was real, or some sort of shared delusion, but I do know this. The forest is alive in ways we can't fully comprehend. It watches us, judges us, and sometimes when we're not careful, it takes us. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of northern Minnesota, and you hear whispers on the wind, or see something tall moving among the trees, don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just run. Run. And don't look back. Because sometimes, when you look too closely at the forest, it looks back at you. And that, my friends, is a gaze you don't want to meet. The dense Alaskan forest closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the untamed wilderness. I had been a park ranger here for years, but this was my first time venturing so far off the normal trails on my own. A series of disappearances in this remote region required investigation, and as the most experienced ranger, I had volunteered to search for the missing hikers. The higher-ups warned me against going solo, but I assured them I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Plus, we were short-staffed after the recent budget cuts. If I didn't go now, before the harsh Alaskan winter set in, those lost souls might never be found. I adjusted my heavy backpack and trudged onward, my boots crunching the carpet of dried pine needles underfoot. Despite the midday hour, the towering evergreens blocked out much of the sun, casting everything in a murky gloom. An oppressive stillness hung in the air, broken only by my labored breaths and the occasional bird call. As I rounded a bend in the faint trail, an icy tendril of unease crept up my spine. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. I surveyed my surroundings with a critical eye. The trees looked the same as always, until they didn't. Were those claw marks gouged into that trunk? Had that oddly shaped shadow always lurked in my peripheral vision? I gave my head a firm shake and picked up my pace. I was just giving in to the jitters that came with being alone in the backcountry. Nothing more than my imagination getting carried away after one too many campfire ghost stories. Still, I couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched as the forest swallowed me up. A couple miles in, I paused to check my map and get my bearings. As I knelt to brush some debris off a fallen log, a shape in the mud caught my eye. I leaned closer to examine the unusual animal print. At first glance, it resembled a wolf track, but the proportions and depth seemed strangely distorted. No wolf could have left a print that size. A bear, perhaps. But the shape was all wrong. This track belonged to no creature I could identify. Perplexed, I rose and scanned the area for more signs of the mystery animal. Several yards away, I spotted another print, then another. They formed an impossible trail, with an uncanny mix of features from multiple species. The stride length made no sense either, alternating between loping bounds and tight clusters of steps. Every park ranger instinct screamed that such an amalgam could not exist in nature. I pulled out my camera and snapped a few photos of the bizarre tracks. My brow furrowed as I zoomed in on the images. It almost looked as if the tracks were changing subtly between each photo, though that had to be a trick of the light. Absorbed in the photos, I didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a voice cut through the eerie quiet. "Find something interesting there, Ranger." I nearly leapt out of my skin as I spun to face the interloper. A grizzled older man in tattered flannel regarded me with suspicious eyes. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime in these woods. "Oh, hello," I said, trying to slow my racing heart. "I didn't see you there. I'm Ranger Davis with the Park Service. And you are—" I let the question hang. "Hank. I live round these parts," he replied gruffly. "Grew up here. Know these woods better than anyone." His gaze flicked down to the odd tracks, then back up to me. "What brings you way out here, all by your lonesome?" I hesitated, unsure how much to divulge. "Just doing some routine backcountry patrols. We like to keep an eye on the more remote areas." Hank gave a derisive sniff. "Is that so? Seems a mite reckless, wandering these hills solo-like, especially with folks going missing and all." My ears pricked up at that. "Missing? What do you know about the disappearances?" "More than I ought to, probably." He scuffed a boot over the strange prints, erasing them. "Let's just say there's things out here that don't take kindly to outsiders, things that ain't natural." A chill that had nothing to do with the brisk air shivered through me. "What kinds of things? Animal? Human?" Hanks let out a mirthless chuckle. "Hoo boy, ain't that the question?" He looked over his shoulder, as if checking for potential eavesdroppers. Lowering his voice, he continued, "It's ancient, Ranger, old as these hills theyselves, and hungry. You'd best turn back now while you still can." With those ominous words, he turned on his heel and melted back into the underbrush, leaving me with far more questions than answers. I looked down at the few undisturbed tracks, dread pooling in my gut. What had I gotten myself into? I stood there, lost in uneasy contemplation, when a rustle of leaves made me whip my head up. Between the distant trees, for just a split second, I glimpsed something. A flash of brown, leathery texture. Antlers or horns, perhaps. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the shape vanished. A deer, surely. That's all it could have been at that distance. And yet, the proportions, the way it slipped through the dense foliage and out of view, it felt decidedly undeer-like. I waited a few beats, hardly daring to breathe, but the forest had returned to its former stillness. With an unsteady hand, I marked the location of the creature sighting in my notebook, alongside a sketch of the uncanny tracks. As I stared at the rough lines on the page, the feeling of isolation pressed in, smothering and absolute. I was a mere speck in this vast wilderness, utterly alone and insignificant. Anything could happen out here, and no one would ever know. Snapping the notebook shut with more force than necessary, I shoved down the rising tide of anxiety. I had a job to do. I couldn't let a few scary stories and overactive imagination get the best of me. Squaring my shoulders, I hefted my pack and soldiered on, deeper into the waiting trees. Time slipped away from me as I forged ahead, scanning the area for any sign of the missing hikers. The weak sunlight filtering through the branches grew fainter with each passing hour, shadows stretching and distorting into strange shapes. I needed to make camp soon, before full dark fell. As I searched for a suitable spot to pitch my tent, a flicker of color amid the brown and green caught my eye. I altered course and pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth. Tangled in a snarl of ivy was a torn piece of fabric, faded red with splatters of what looked like old bloodstains. My heart hammered as I cut it free. It was a scrap of flannel shirt similar to what one of the missing hikers was last seen wearing. I scoured the immediate vicinity and discovered a half-buried backpack, moldering leaves spilling from a ragged hole in the side. Dropping to my knees, I yanked it out and rummaged through its scattered contents, dread mounting with each item: a tattered trail map, a crushed packet of freeze-dried food, a cracked compass, all standard hiking gear, but no sign of the owner. What had happened here? Was this just an abandoned cache, or something more sinister? The scene gave me a distinctly bad feeling, like I was a trespasser disturbing an ancient crime scene. I bagged the shredded shirt and compass as evidence, and noted the pack's location. The last traces of light were slipping away, and I still needed to make camp before nightfall. With a final glance at the ominous scene, I moved on. Finding a small clearing, I hastily set up my tent and built a modest fire. As I hunched over the weak flames, a can of beans balanced on my knee. The night noises began. At first it was the usual sounds: the hoot of an owl, the skitter of small creatures in the undergrowth. But gradually other noises filtered in. A snap of twigs, circling just beyond the reach of my firelight. A low guttural growl that sent icy rivulets of fear trickling down my back. And threading through it all, an eerie keening that rose and fell in undulating waves. The hair on my nape prickled as I strained to make out words in that unearthly moan. It almost sounded like my name. But that was impossible. Just the whistling of wind through branches, a product of fatigue and nerves. I was alone out here, completely, utterly alone. Gripping my hunting knife tightly, I retreated to my tent and burrowed into my sleeping bag. I left my boots on and knife unsheathed, though I wasn't sure what good it would do me. Flinching at every rustle and howl, I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for dawn. Sleep proved elusive, as the night stretched on into a hellish eternity. Each time I started to drift off, a twig would snap, or the keening would swell louder, jerking me back to heart-pounding wakefulness. As the hours crawled by, paranoia nibbled at the edges of my mind. The noises were too purposeful, too focused on my little camp. Something was out there in the dark, watching, waiting. I huddled in my flimsy nylon cocoon, hardly daring to breathe as I tracked the thing's progress around my tent. It circled like a predator toying with trapped prey, never quite coming into view. I caught the occasional flicker of an inky silhouette slipping between trees, or a glint of greenish eyeshine, but never more than a half-glimpsed suggestion. Then, in the darkest pit of the night, the whispering began. At first it was barely audible under the groans and rustles, a sibilant thread of sound, more sensed than heard, but it grew in volume and clarity, until the voice enveloped me like an icy fog. "Ranger," it breathed, drawing out the syllables into a repulsive hiss. "Ranger Davis." I clapped hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The insidious whisper drilled directly into my brain. "I see you," it continued. Its tone changed, taking on a hideously distorted version of my own voice. "Don't you know it's dangerous to be out here all alone? Such terrible things happen in these woods." "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" A blood-curdling screech answered me. Half cougar scream, half human. I cringed against my wadded-up sleeping bag, trembling uncontrollably. That was no mere animal. I didn't know what manner of monstrosity lurked in the shadows, but it was intelligent, and it had me dead to rights. After that shriek, the whispering stopped. The thing grew bored of its torment and faded back into the forest. But there would be no rest for me. I spent the remainder of the night propped upright, drenched in fierce sweat, jumping at every noise. When the first anemic light of dawn seeped through the tent's walls, I startled so badly I almost stabbed myself in the knee with my knife. I poked my head cautiously out of the tent flap. The pale sun did little to brighten the oppressive murk, but at least I could see more than a couple feet in front of my face. I swept my gaze across the campsite and fell back with a choked cry. My gear had been ransacked. Not by a bear or other scavenger, but with a deliberate surgical precision. The tent's rainfly hung in ragged strips from gashes too even for claws. My cookpot had been meticulously crushed flat, like a tin can under a boot, and everywhere, gouged into the bark of surrounding trees, were strange symbols and crude outlines of horn-crowned humanoids, marking territory, staking claim. There would be no breakfast and restocking for me. It was all I could do to stuff my torn sleeping bag and pitiful remnants of equipment into my shredded pack. Every instinct screamed to flee this place. Now, Before the monster came back to finish what it started, I snatched up my knife and what was left of my food and water. Then, with a final glance at the violated camp, I plunged back into the woods at a stumbling run, unsure if I was running to something or away. All I knew was I had to move, or die. Branches slapped my face and snagged my pack as I crashed through the underbrush in a blind panic. My driving purpose of finding the lost hikers had fled my mind, replaced by the single primal need to escape. I had to get out of these eldritch woods, away from the creature that defied natural law. But the harder I pushed my battered body onward, the more disoriented I became. The sun dwindled and faded, though it was only midday. Shadows pressed in claustrophobically tight. Had I passed that gnarled, almost humanoid tree stump before? Was I going in circles? There were no landmarks in this bowl of foliage, just an endless smothering swath of green. I clawed my way to the top of a steep rise, my lungs aflame and legs rubbery. From the crest I hoped to catch a glance of a road, a trail, anything that could lead me back to civilization, but the view froze the breath in my chest. For miles, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but forest. Dense, primeval, impenetrable. It spilled over distant peaks and choked valleys. No hint of man's presence broke the eerie green swells. I was utterly adrift, a moat engulfed by a dark ocean of trees. And in that expanse I was not alone. A piercing cry rent the air behind me, spurring me back into my stumbling flight down the hill. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature loped along my trail, roughly bipedal, but moving with an agility and speed no human could match. Its form seemed to shift, 1 second an emaciated leathery shape, the next a shaggy bulk with too many bony protrusions. The only constant was the glinting obsidian of its eyes and the wicked curve of claws that flexed with each grasping swipe of its arms. I couldn't outrun this thing. Sooner or later, it would have me. My only chance was to find a place to hide, and hope rescue came before it caught my scent again. Veering sharply right, I half ran, half tumbled down a crumbling shale embankment. Pain flared in my ankle as I landed wrong at the bottom. I didn't have time to assess the damage. I could already hear the rattle and hiss of the creature scrabbling down after me. Favoring my good leg, I lurched onward, breath sobbing in my throat. Each step sent agony rippling up to my hip, but I couldn't slow down. The forest had swallowed me whole, and I had no choice but to follow where it led. As I staggered around an outcropping of rock, a new sound joined the creature's shrieks and my labored breathing. The babble of fast-moving water close ahead. A surge of hope gave wings to my battered feet. If I could reach the river, I might be able to mask my scent and confuse my pursuer. I burst through a screen of willows onto the grassy bank of a turbulent river. Without hesitation, I splashed into the shallows, gasping as the snowmelt-fueled water struck my overheated skin. I slogged forward until I reached an area where the current slowed slightly, and several large boulders created eddies. With the last of my strength, I hauled myself atop the nearest rock, well clear of the water. Pressing myself flat against the sun-warmed stone, I peered back toward shore just in time to see the creature lope out of the underbrush. It paced the bank, head swiveling side to side, nostrils flaring as it tasted the air. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. After several tense moments, the thing unleashed a frustrated screech. Then, rather than stepping into the water, it began to change. Its body rippled like heat distortion, limbs and hide stretching and shrinking until it resembled a massive bird of prey, its leathery wings easily spanning 12 feet. With a final defiant screech, it flapped ponderously into the air and wheeled away over the treetops. The downdraft of its wings raised white caps on the surface of the river. I collapsed against the boulder, eyes gritty with exhausted tears. I had temporarily escaped the creature's clutches, but my ordeal was far from over. I was still lost, injured, and being hunted by an inconceivable monstrosity with powers beyond explanation. As the adrenaline ebbed from my system, I finally looked down at my injured ankle, wincing as I probed the swollen joint. Not broken, but definitely badly sprained. It would seriously hamper my trek out of this hellish place. I gingerly lowered myself back into the calf-deep water and waded toward the far bank, knowing I couldn't stay exposed on the rock. Dragging my waterlogged body ashore, my heart stuttered at the sight of the creature's parting gift. Smeared in the mud at the edge of the tree line were 3 words. No way out. The malevolent message erased any faint hope that the thing might give up its pursuit. Gritting my teeth, I pushed to my feet and limped into the forest, following the river downstream. My best chance of finding my way back to the main park trails was to stick close to the water, and the river just might deter the creature from attacking outright, as it seemed reluctant to cross running water. But I couldn't count on that tentative defense forever. Sooner or later, I would have to leave the riverside, and the creature would be waiting. I had to find shelter before then, a place to hole up and tend my wounds. As I slogged onward, a slash of discontinuity in the wall of trees caught my eye. I altered course and hobbled closer for a better look. There, nearly concealed under a choking mass of vines, was the time-worn facade of a cabin. The ancient logs were silvery with age, the windows gaping voids of shadow. It hardly looked inhabitable. But any port in a storm, and I was in the tempest of my life. Mustering my dwindling strength, I struggled toward the ruin, praying it would prove sanctuary rather than tomb. The cabin door squealed on rusted hinges, the groan echoing oddly in the hushed forest. It took 2 kicks with my good leg to unstick it enough to squeeze inside. I had to stoop under the sagging lintel, centuries of rot and moisture warping the entire structure into a rheumatic hunch. The interior smelled heavily of mold, dust, and a cloying undertone of old blood. Wan light filtered greenly through gaps between the logs, motes dancing lazily through the stagnant air. The single room had been tossed by careless hands, its meager furnishings strewn about as if a wild storm had raged within the walls. A crude wooden table listed drunkenly on 3 legs in the center, the 4th splintered into kindling. Moth-eaten furs and a stained mattress tick-drooped from a cord-lashed bed frame. Above the soot-blackened hearth, a trophy mount jutted. Not a typical deer or elk, but an elongated skull crowned in spiraling bone spires. Definitely no creature I'd ever seen. But the true horror lay in the detritus of previous occupants. Shreds of clothing, crushed camping gear, cracked cell phones, all the trappings of modernity mixed amongst items from a far older time. And everywhere, splashed across walls and floor like macabre abstract art, the rust brown of long-dried blood. So this was the lair of the creature. Not just a den, but a trophy room, where it brought its victims. A wave of despair crushed the air from my lungs. Those campers and hikers I'd been searching for, there would be no rescuing them, only avenging. As I limped further into the room, glass crunched under my boots. Crouching, unmindful of my protesting ankle, I brushed away leaf litter to reveal a shattered picture frame. With shaking fingers, I extracted the photograph. Despite water and age damage, I could make out a group of men, Native American by their dress, posing proudly before the very cabin I now stood in. The date stamped in the corner was 1903. I flipped the photo over, hoping for some identifying names or location. On the back, penned in a spidery scrawl, were the words, "The Last Hunt. Black Elk, Hahaka Sapa, Skinwalker. Our work is finished." The musty air turned to ice in my lungs. I knew those names from my time among the local tribes. Black Elk was a famed Sioux medicine man, a fierce protector of his people's ways. I'd heard whispers of his battles with unnatural evils. Dark things spawned in the shadows beyond firelight. But what was a skinwalker? The term rang a faint, dreadful bell, but I couldn't place it. Tucking the photo into my pocket, I scoured the rest of the cabin for anything that might aid my survival or fill in the blanks of this fragment of history. But aside from a few sealed tins of ancient food and a Bowie knife caked in something I desperately hoped wasn't human blood, the place had been stripped clean of anything useful by decades of transience and ne'er-do-wells, and more recently by the creature. The shadows were thickening into evening murk. I couldn't risk a fire, not with that thing out there, but my small flashlight still worked. Retrieving the knife, I propped myself in a corner with the clearest sightlines to the door and windows. The blade would make a poor defense against a supernatural being, but it was better than harsh language. As I settled in for a long night of terrified vigilance, I realized with sinking certainty that I was trapped. This remote cabin was as much a prison as it was a shelter. I could only pray that rescue would come before the creature tired of toying with me and closed in for the kill. For the first time in my life, I had no plan, no clear trail to follow, only the blind instinct to survive no matter the cost. As the night noises started up again outside the splintered walls, I clutched my puny flashlight and willed the dawn to come. It was going to be a long night. Time slurred into a muddy flow, exhaustion and dread blurring its passage. The night dragged on, my body sinking into a kind of trance state, where nothing existed but the slow in-out of breath and the weight of the knife in my fist. I had long ago given up any pretense of plan or escape. I merely endured. Then, cutting across the cottony hum between my ears, a new sound, distinct, deliberate. A footstep on the threshold. It started soft, the scuff of feet, fabric sighing across floorboards, the creak of weight settled on ancient wood. Then a rhythmic tap-tap-tap, sharp and taunting, inches from the barricaded door. I scrabbled upright, knife extended with quivering arm. Was the creature done with the cat-and-mouse game, ready to end my torment? I recoiled against the wall as a voice oozed through the gaps in the logs. Little pig, let me come in." The voice was a guttural rasp, an obscene mockery of the old nursery rhyme. I cringed at the slow drag of claws across the door, trembling as the voice shifted into an all-too-familiar tone. "Open the door, honey. It's your old pal, Hank." The cadence matched the old hunter's perfectly, but underlaid with a sepulchral rattle. The thing chuckled wetly at my sharp intake of breath. "Surprised? You're an open book, Ranger. I know every thought, every memory, every fear in that head of yours. That's the problem with you outsiders. You come into our territory, leaving psychic scent trails, never knowing what's tracking you." I flinched as the tap-tap-tap resumed, circling the perimeter of the cabin. It paused by the sole window, a deeper patch of black against night. A shaft of moonlight struck its face as it leaned into view, and I reeled back in horror. Hank's features stared back at me, but twisted into a vulpine leer utterly alien to the gruff woodsman. His skin looked waxy, semi-translucent, more mask than living flesh, and the eyes, depthless pits of swirling void, windows into an other world of malice and hunger. It was devouring me with those eyes, stripping away my humanity, my very identity. I tore my gaze away with a sob. It wasn't Hank. The creature was wearing his face, puppeting his voice and memories, all to dig barbs into my mind, break me with psychological warfare before making the killing strike. "Do you know what we are?" Not Hank hissed, its breath fogging the glass. "What you're dealing with. I am Hihaka Sapa, Black Elk, the last of the true skinwalkers. Do you even know what that means, little ranger?" It grinned at my headshake, baring teeth too sharp and numerous for any human mouth. A skinwalker is power. The power to wear any shape, any face, to feed on terror and rend flesh from bone. Once, we were many. Once, the people feared and respected us. Now, I am the only one left. A dwindling spirit in a dying world. The parody of Hank's face sloughed away like shed snakeskin, revealing a nebulous churning mass shot through with lambent green embers. But this is still my world, my forest. Did you really think you could trespass here without consequence? That I would let you steal away my prey, my rightful meat? Shapes boiled to the surface of its malleable flesh. Screaming faces, grasping hands, the antlers of that strange skull mount. All the stolen lives, the consumed essences, writhing in overlapping cacophony. I cried out, a meaningless animal sound, and thrust my paltry knife at the window. That only amused the creature. Chuckling, it slid out of view, the susurrus of its passage fading into the groans and rustles of the nightly forest. But I knew it wasn't gone. Just biding its time, savoring my agony and confusion. It would be back to finish our little tete-a-tete, and no matter what form it took, what mind it pilfered, the result would be the same. A lonely death, so far from any help or hope. The knife slipped from my numb fingers as I slid down the wall into a boneless crouch. What was the use of fighting? I was a mote in the eye of a pitiless universe. A speck of sentience about to be snuffed out by primordial forces beyond my comprehension. Hot tears spilled down my face, carving runnels through the grime. In that moment, I almost welcomed the idea of surrendering. Anything to be free of the mind-shredding terror. The unbearable pressure of fending off an unnatural evil far beyond mortal scope. At least it would be an ending. A consummation. Better than this unendurable limbo. But as I slumped against the fetid timbers of the cabin floor, my fingertips brushed a scrap of paper, shaken loose from my pocket during my mad scramble. The photograph of Black Elk and his mysterious party, faded and blurred but still legible. I clutched it like a talisman, a lifeline hurling me up from the pit of despair. Black Elk had defeated this thing before, driven it into dormancy, if never truly killing it. He was medicine man, a servant of the powers. If he could face the skinwalker and survive, there had to be a way. Ignoring the shriek of protest from my joints, I pushed to my feet, bracing against the wall. I would not lay down and die like a stunned rabbit. I was a ranger, damn it. A defender of these lands and all who walked them. It was far too late to save myself, but I could still avenge the skinwalker's victims. Cut the heart from this shadowed corner of the world and pin it, writhing to the light. I didn't need to outfight the creature, just outwit and outlast it. If I could hang on until dawn, make it back to the river, the running water. Skinwalkers had power, but also limitations. It was a start, lips peeling back from my teeth in a feral grin. I brandished my knife at the waiting night. All right, you bastard. Let's finish this. Come and get me. The darkness echoed with monstrous laughter, and the hunt was on again. I exploded out of the cabin in a lurching run, dodging and weaving like a mad thing. Every shadow seethed with the promise of claws. Every sigh of wind spoke with stolen voices. But I was through with skulking and hiding. If I was to be prey, I would make the skinwalker work for its meal. My ankle shrieked like a rusty hinge with each jolting stride, the pain a red veil over my vision. But I used it, funneling the agony into the engine of my flight. The fixed thought of the river my only guide. I had to reach it before the creature cut me off or ran me to ground. The night behind me reverberated with the skinwalker's mind-rending cries. A disorienting melange of human and animal. The heavy thud of its misshapen feet drew ever closer, the fetid heat of its breath searing the back of my neck. But I had one final trick up my tattered sleeve. In the last mad dash, I shrugged out of my pack, spilling its meager contents behind me. The empty tins from the cabin, the cracked compass, a precious flask of rainwater. Each clattered and clanged as the skinwalker trampled them, a breadcrumb trail to slow its terrible advance. Finally, as the pack itself tangled in the thing's legs, I heard it stumble with an almost comical squawk. A fleeting sensation of triumph surged through my veins, lending wings to my feet. The white noise of the river crescendoed ahead, its rushing babble an anthem of hope. I risked a glance over my shoulder as I careened out of the tree line. The skinwalker thrashed free of the pack's embrace and rallied for one last charge. Its body seethed and stretched like churning clay, cycling through forms in quick succession. Hank's cruel leer, a bristling bear shape, the sickle curves of the antlered skull. Finally, as if realizing the limitations of physical form, it collapsed into a bounding pool of utterly black matter, a void-made material. That liquid darkness crashed against my heels as I hit the verge of the river. Time seemed to slow as I gathered my legs beneath me, the far bank a mocking distance away, with a roar to match the skinwalker's skull-splitting cry. I launched myself out over the frothing rapids. For a single breathless moment I was flying, untethered from anything solid or sane. Then I struck the far bank in a graceless tangle of limbs, star-spangled darkness crowding the edges of my vision, choking on river water and my own tears. I dragged my brutalized body up the bank, unable to tear my gaze from the horror behind me. The skinwalker flowed to the very lip of the water, a hypnotic tide of flickering eyes and yawning mouths. But it came no further. As the leaden light of dawn started to bleed across the sky, the creature shuddered and recoiled, its substance breaking into wispy tendrils. It spat a few last curses in a language unheard by the modern world, then sluiced back into the waiting forest with a sibilant hiss. I collapsed on the opposite verge, boneless with exhaustion and residual dread. Overhead, the rising sun burned away the clinging mist, rendering the world in its usual colors again. But nothing would ever look the same to me. Not after what I'd seen. What I now knew stalked the spaces between. I'd caught a glimpse behind the veil of reality, and I couldn't unsee it. A sigh that was half laugh, half sob spilled from my cracked lips. I had made it, survived, but there would be no celebrations, no reunions. Even if I mustered the strength to hike out of there, I could never go back to the man I was before. That ranger was gone, devoured by the skinwalker as surely as the lost campers. In his place was something new, something harder, warrior, and infinitely more tired. All I wanted in that moment was to lay my head down and sleep for a century. Let the forest have its secrets and sorrows. But I couldn't. Not yet. Grunting with effort, I fished the battered photo of black elk from my pocket and held it up to the light. Now I understood all too well the somber, burdened expressions on those men's faces. They too had stared into the darkness and taken up its duties as their own. I had a new mission now, to safeguard this place. The dense forest closed in around me as I hiked the overgrown trail, my park ranger uniform already damp with sweat in the sticky summer heat. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly. My coworker Mike, another seasoned ranger, walked a few paces ahead. "Remind me again why we're bushwhacking out to the ass end of nowhere," I called out, swatting a spider web away from my face. Mike glanced back, his expression grim. 2 more hikers went missing last night. A young couple last seen around the Matheson Cove area. I frowned. This was the 4th disappearance in 2 months. You think it's connected to the others? Has to be. And I'm starting to think the crazy stories the locals are always spinning might not be so crazy after all. I knew the stories he meant. Tales shared in hushed whispers about strange creatures lurking in the woods. Beasts that walked on 2 legs but weren't quite human. The native elders called them the dogmen. "Those are just backwoods superstitions," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But with each new missing persons case, those old legends were getting harder to dismiss. We emerged into a clearing and Mike held up a hand, signaling me to stop. He pointed to a set of tracks in the damp earth. They looked canine but far too large to be any wolf or coyote I'd ever seen, and the long gashes in a nearby oak trunk were over 7 feet high. My blood ran cold. A twig snapped in the undergrowth behind us. We both whipped around, reaching for our sidearms. Then an unearthly howl split the air so loud it made my ears ring. It sounded almost human, and yet not human at all. Mike turned to me, his face white as a sheet. "Radio for backup," he said hoarsely. "Tell them we found the hikers, or at least what's left of them." He pointed a shaky finger. There, caught on a blackberry bush at the clearing's edge, was a torn and bloody shred of flannel shirt. My stomach turned. The dogmen had claimed more victims, and now they knew we were here too. The agonized screaming seemed to go on forever, even after the wet snapping of bones and cartilage had ceased. Then, silence. A silence almost more terrible than the sounds of carnage that preceded it. I crouched behind a fallen tree, clutching my pistol with shaking hands. Tears streamed down my face, but I barely noticed them. All I could see was Mike, or what was left of him, strewn across the blood-soaked grass of the clearing. They had torn him apart like a pack of wolves on a downed deer. Except no wolves stood on 2 legs. No wolves had quasi-human faces that somehow made the savagery even more horrifying. I had to move, and fast. They would smell his blood, pick up my scent. I had to get to the ranger station, call for help. But a deeper animal instinct screamed for me to stay put, stay silent, become invisible. A soft growl made my head snap up. 2 yellow eyes stared at me from the shadows between the trees, the eyes of a beast, and yet filled with a malevolent intelligence that was heartbreakingly familiar. "Oh God," I choked out. "Oh God, Mike." Then the creature stepped into a shaft of sunlight and I saw it fully for the first time. It had Mike's park ranger uniform, torn and shredded, and darkened with gore. It walked upright on Mike's long legs, but they bent backwards at the knees like a dog's hind legs. Mike's hands tipped with curving black talons. And the face, dear God, the face, covered in brindled fur, the muzzle elongated into a wolf-like snout. But the eyes, though jaundiced and red-rimmed, were still hideously Mike's eyes, almost human, filled with torment and ravenous hunger. The jaws opened, revealing jagged canine teeth, and a strangled howl issued from the depths of what had once been Mike's throat. Then 2 more creatures slunk out of the shadows behind it to flank it on either side, and I knew with numb certainty that these were the missing hikers, transformed into monsters. The one that had been Mike reared back its head and let out a soul-shattering howl, and the others joined in, the sound echoing off the mountains. A hunting call. They had my scent now. The human part of them was gone, and I was the prey. I ran, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. Briars tore at my legs. Low branches whipped my face. My heart jackhammered against my ribs as I gulped for breath. The howling erupted again behind me. Closer now. They were toying with me. They could have taken me down already if they wanted to. This was a game to them, and I was a mouse to their pack of feral cats. I thought of the old legends, the warnings from the tribal elders. They took our people, the elders said, took them and changed them, turned them into the dogmen. I had always scoffed at such tales. How could a person transform like that? It wasn't possible. But I had seen it with my own eyes. Mike, the missing hikers, reshaped into nightmarish parodies of man and beast. And if the old stories were true, if the dogmen were real, then that could only mean one thing. I was to be the next one taken, the next to join the pack. The ground dropped out from under me, and I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling and sliding in the damp leaves. I landed hard at the bottom, the breath knocked from my lungs. The world spun dizzily. Then I heard the panting, heard the soft pad of paws, the click of nails on stone, heard the low snarls, so close, right above me. I looked up into 3 pairs of glowing yellow eyes. They had me cornered. A snout pressed close to my face, snuffling, inhaling my scent. I felt the heat of fetid breath, saw the strings of drool between yellowed fangs. The one that had been Mike growled, low and menacing. "Please," I whispered. "Please don't do this. I know you're still in there, Mike. You have to fight it." For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in those ghastly eyes. A flicker of the man I once knew, but then it was gone, swallowed by animal hunger. The jaws opened wide and I saw down the black abyss of the gullet. I screamed, but the killing bite never came. The beast's head whipped around at the sound of a sharp snap in the woods. Then another and another, the crunch of wheels on gravel, engines roar. The park rangers had arrived. Too late for Mike, too late for the missing hikers. But maybe if I was very lucky. Not too late for me. The dogmen, no. The creatures that had once been Mike and the 2 hikers swung their heads toward the noise, ears swiveling. For a heartbeat, I stared into Mike's tormented eyes one last time. Then the pack melted into the shadows of the trees, leaving me alive. For now. I collapsed against the damp earth, sobs racking my chest. The image of Mike's mangled body played over and over in my mind, and the knowledge of what he had become, the demons that now wore the faces of the missing, filled me with a horror beyond all imagining. I knew then that this nightmare was only beginning. And God help me. I had no idea how to stop it. They're real, Chief. The dogmen are real. I paced like a caged animal in front of Ron Foster's desk, my mud-spattered ranger uniform drawing wary stares from the other officers in the Timberline County Police Station. They all thought I was crazy. Hell, I probably sounded crazy, but I had to make them understand. "Now sit down, Nancy," Chief Foster said, not unkindly. He was an old friend of my father's, had known me since I was a girl. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. Once the shock wears off..." "This isn't shock." I slammed my palms on his desk, making him flinch. "It isn't PTSD. It isn't heat stroke, or dehydration, or any other rational explanation you want to throw at me. I saw Mike die, Chief. I saw him get torn apart by those things. And I saw what they did to him after. What they turned him into. I could still see Mike's body putting itself back together, reshaping into that unspeakable beast form." The other officers exchanged skeptical glances, muttering behind their hands. They thought my story was the wild ramblings of a traumatized woman. Just like the old tales of the native tribes. Silly superstitions, not to be believed. "We're dealing with forces beyond our understanding here, Chief," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "If we don't stop the dogmen, they'll keep taking people, keep adding to their ranks. It will never end." Chief Foster leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He looked as haggard as I felt. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Nancy, I know you believe what you saw. Hell, maybe you did see some kind of animal attack your partner. I don't know. Whatever it was must have been rabid, or higher than a kite on bath salts. But then the trauma made you imagine things that weren't real. Your mind couldn't cope with the carnage in any other way." "Imagine?" I stared at him in angry disbelief. "You think I imagined Mike getting up after he was disemboweled? Imagined him sprouting fur and claws? Do I need to show you the tracks again? What you need is rest, Nancy. Rest and a psych evaluation. I'm officially relieving you of field duty as of now." "No, I don't want to hear any arguments," he said. holding up a hand as I opened my mouth to protest. You go home, get some sleep. We'll put every available man on this case. And Nancy, he put his glasses back on and fixed me with a stern look. Under no circumstances are you to discuss these dogmen delusions with anyone, especially not the press. The last thing we need is mass hysteria. Understood? I nodded, throat tight with frustration and helpless anger. They weren't going to listen. No matter what evidence I showed them, their minds were already made up. But I couldn't just sit at home while more innocent people were stalked and transformed, while that pack of abominations roamed free. I had to find a way to stop the dogmen, even if it meant doing it alone, even if it cost me everything. I pored over the old books and newspaper archives for hours in the dim stacks of the local university library, searching for any scrap of information on the dogmen. The college students gave me odd looks, whispering and giggling as they passed by, no doubt wondering what an unkempt, wild-eyed park ranger was doing, frantically rummaging through dusty tomes of local folklore and native legends. I ignored them. I was on a mission. According to the old stories, the evil spirit known as the Wendigo was the one responsible for transforming men into the dogmen. The Wendigo was a malevolent creature, sometimes described as a gaunt humanoid with a deer skull head, other times as an emaciated spirit that possessed the living. But the one common thread was that it hungered for human flesh, and that hunger was passed on to its victims. Most of the accounts I found dismissed the Wendigo and the dogmen as myth, cautionary tales to warn against greed and cannibalism. There was no physical evidence. Academia agreed. No solid proof, only anecdotes and folklore. But buried deep in one yellowed, crumbling tome, I found a ray of hope. It was a translated account from a French-Canadian fur trapper in the 1600s who claimed to have survived a dogman attack. The trapper and his party had been exploring new hunting grounds near Timberline County when they were set upon by the beasts. Most were slaughtered, but the trapper escaped. And he described destroying one of the creatures with fire. Fire, of course. It was so obvious I wanted to smack myself. Nearly every culture's lore spoke of fire as a purifying force against evil spirits. I just had to pray it worked against Wendigo spawn too. I hefted my axe and sheathed my long knife, tucking road flares into my belt. Not ideal, but they would have to do until I could get back to my truck and assemble some more potent firebombs. Molotov cocktails, maybe. The thought made me laugh humorlessly. What would Chief Foster say if he could see me now, gearing up like some kind of Rambo? He'd probably have me committed on the spot. Let him. I couldn't worry about Foster or the department anymore. I couldn't worry about my job, my reputation, or my sanity. All that mattered was stopping the dogmen before they multiplied beyond hope of containment. I touched my holstered pistol, set my jaw, and stalked out of the library. The creatures had taken Mike. They wouldn't take anyone else. Not while I still drew breath. This ended tonight. The forest closed around me like a clammy green fist under the sickle moon. Each step took me further from civilization, from help, from hope. But I pressed on, well supplied and sure of my quarry. The creatures would come to me. As a lone human female in their new hunting grounds, I was easy prey. I was counting on it. I half slid, half stumbled down the steep bank and into the ravine where the dogmen had first surrounded me. The fetid reek of death hung heavy in the night air. My stomach knotted at the sight of clotted blood and gnawed bones scattered in the leaves, all that remained of Mike and the poor hikers. Low snarls rose from the shadows and luminous eyes blinked open all around me, glaring yellow. They had been waiting for me, expecting my return. The underbrush rustled as dark shapes detached themselves from the forest and stalked closer. The stink of carrion and musk thickened. I drew my pistol with calm, cold purpose. Part of me grieved for these monsters, these tortured beings that wore the hollowed-out shells of the innocent, of my friend. But there was no saving them anymore. All I could do was grant them the mercy of oblivion, assuming I could get clear shots at their hearts before they took me down. They circled me, lips peeling back from jagged teeth in awful grins. The knowledge of their assured victory shone bright with feral cunning in their eyes. I was alone, outnumbered, outmatched in strength and speed, easy meat for their bellies and their pack, but not entirely defenseless. My other hand slipped inside my jacket, fingers closing on the bundle of road flares and rags. I had doused them in lamp oil and stuffed them into bottles, The best approximation of Molotovs I could manage on short notice. If I was right, if the old lore was true, then I had a slim chance of coming out of this alive. If I was wrong, if the fire didn't stop them, then at least my death would be quicker than Mike's. It was the only comfort I could give myself. The creature that had been Mike crept closer with a fluidity of movement that was achingly familiar. It cocked its head, sizing me up, looking for an opening. My heart clenched, but there could be no hesitation, no mercy, not anymore. I whispered an apology under my breath, thumbed off my pistol's safety and launched myself at the pack with a wild cry. And then there was nothing but the chaos of flame and gunfire and blood. The conflagration lit the night, the howling of the dogmen mingling with the roar of the fire. I staggered back as one of the creatures lurched toward me, its fur ablaze. It snapped at me with sizzling jaws, claws swiping. I fired point blank into its chest, the shot booming like a cannon in the close confines of the ravine. Dark blood sprayed as the thing crumpled into the carpet of burning leaves. But two more took its place, barely slowed by the flames engulfing their hides. The lamp oil burned fast and hot, the broken bottles no longer protection. I spun, unloading my pistol at the lunging beasts. Bullets punctured flesh and bone, but they kept coming, maddened by pain and the Wendigo's bloodlust. One clipped me with a claw before I could dodge, laying open my thigh. I cried out and fell back, warm wetness soaking my shredded pants leg. The monster that had been Mike rose up before me, its fur crisped and blackened, the man shape underneath seared and oozing. My pistol clicked empty. With shaking hands, I fumbled for another clip, but the creature was on me in a flash of teeth and charred fur. It bowled me over and pinned me to the blood-slick earth, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I stared up into its eyes, so familiar and yet so alien, and saw only ravenous hunger looking back. "Mike, please," I choked out. "Don't do this. It's me, Nancy. We're friends. You have to remember." For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a twitch of uncertainty. But then the jaws opened wide, strings of drool sizzling as they hit my face. I closed my eyes, not wanting Mike's transformed visage to be the last thing I ever saw. But the killing blow never landed. There was a meaty thud, and the creature's weight was ripped away. My eyes flew open to see Chief Foster standing over me, a fire axe dripping with gore. He reached down and hauled me to my feet. "I told you to go home, Nancy," he shouted over the roar of the flames. All around us, the other officers battled the snarling dogmen with bullets and fire. The ravine had become a scene out of hell itself. "You wouldn't have believed me," I said, snatching up my dropped gun and slamming in a fresh clip. "I had to do this alone. I had to stop them." Together we beat back the pack, the creatures shrieking as the flames consumed them. In the end, the monsters that had once been Mike and the missing hikers lay dead, their bodies slowly shifting back to human form in the flickering firelight. I collapsed to my knees in the blood and ash, exhausted in body and spirit. It was over. I had done it. I had avenged Mike and ended the threat of the dogmen. But as Chief Foster helped me limp out of the ravine, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The Wendigo still lurked out there in the darkness of the forest, waiting, hungry, ready to make more monsters,